Welcome to this tutorial walkthrough on the Co-op Federal Funding Calculator that RMI has developed. As a reminder, RMI is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to supporting clean energy development. We've developed our Co-op Federal Funding Calculator to be a screening tool to support decision-making by cooperatives and stakeholders working with cooperatives. Cooperatives, over the last few months, have developed ambitious plans to deploy clean energy all over rural America. And these plans, in part, have been a reaction to new federal support programs that have been developed through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. This calculator can help cooperatives figure out how to take advantage of existing and new programs like the New ERA program to help make the portfolios of clean energy that they've proposed as affordable for their members as possible, ensuring that these portfolios of projects are able to maximize the benefit of available federal funding to realize the promise of clean new energy. We know that these decisions can really matter, that the use of federal funding can make or break whether a project can move forward and really achieve benefits. And we're here to help you figure out how to make that happen. The Co-op Federal Funding Calculator allows a cooperative to compare different scenarios with multiple portfolios of assets. So what we mean here is that a cooperative can use the calculator to look at different portfolios of clean assets, wind, solar, and storage, built in different years, each year being of build being a portfolio, and then compile them together into scenarios, perhaps with different financing or resource assumptions between different scenarios. Now, cooperatives have to make investments in portfolios of clean energy resources in given years, as well as in a scenario over many years, that meet the financial constraints that they may have under their existing lending or under any potential lending that they may get from the New ERA and other programs. And the model and the calculator allows cooperatives to compare these different scenarios to really ensure that they can meet those constraints while taking advantage of federal incentives to maximize their benefits. So in this video, we're going to go over the layout of the calculator, starting first with the types of outputs, then moving on to really setting up the resource inputs, and then we'll go through how to set up the key financial inputs, including, of course, the specific federal funding that the cooperatives has received. And then finally, we'll talk about how to run the model and look at the results with a couple of examples of portfolios compiled into scenarios to show how the model can be used to compare different scenarios to help inform decision-making on federal incentives. Next, we'll move on to talk about the tool itself. First, I want to introduce you to the tabs in the tool that you'll need to know about. And really, there are three primary tabs in the Excel tool that are important for a user. First, I want to point you to the Instructions and Notes tab, where some basic instructions about how to use the tool can be found. Here, we describe some of the steps that you need to take to enter in a resource portfolio out and calculate the results. And we also describe some of the different inputs and output sections that you'll need to navigate in order to enter in all the information to ultimately get the results that you'll be looking for. Next, I'll move over to the Inputs and Outputs tab itself. You'll see that right now, the tab includes all of the basic inputs and outputs of the model. And the tab right now has been collapsed on the side here. And what you can see is that the tab includes all of the scenario outputs and the summary, as well as resource portfolio outputs and summary. And it includes as well regions where you can introduce and build out your resource portfolio inputs and assumptions, as well as your financial inputs and assumptions. Finally, I wanted to flag that we also have a results tab where you can look at the results from different records, scenarios, and portfolios that you've recorded using the model and compare them and build out charts to graph some of the sensitivities of your outputs to different changes in your input parameters as embodied in different scenarios. So I want to jump in first to really review the outputs that you can expect from this model. What can this model actually show you about your particular inputs and portfolios? And to do that, first of all, I'm going to uncollapse the model's inputs and outputs by pressing up here on the To button so that you can see more clearly the sections of outputs and inputs with a little bit more granularity. So what does this model calculate? Well, again, we mentioned that the model is structured in scenarios and portfolios. A scenario consists of a group of potential portfolios of assets that are built in different years that you're contemplating building. And a scenario is one way in which you might do it with one set of financial assumptions and resource assumptions. Now, what do we calculate at the end of the day? Well, given that set of financing and resource assumptions, what we calculate here are some critical metrics. What are the levelized costs of electricity if you own all of the assets in that scenario? And how does it compare to the levelized cost of energy if you were to instead purchase the power from those portfolios of assets in that scenario? And then you can also compare them, if you have quotes for all of those assets, to manual quotes that you might put in. Now, levelized cost of electricity is one helpful metric, but it's also helpful to know what the overall NPV of member costs is in addition to levelized costs. So we also include the NPVs. And here we also have a summary of the range of the scenario so that you can make sure that that the inputs that you've incorporated here, for example, are in the range that you expected and that you aren't over allocating or double allocating, for example, your New Era award or GRIP or PACE awards in this case. And you can see the total amounts of solar, wind, and storage that you've deployed. Finally, I will note that this section also includes a summary of how the overall scenario does in achieving three very critical financial constraints for cooperatives, which includes whether the scenario is able to achieve the minimum equity ratio that you would input, that you expect for your clean energy asset portfolio, and whether it can also meet some common covenants on financial metrics, in particular, if it can achieve a modified debt service coverage ratio and margin for interest that is acceptable given the covenants that you may have on other debt in your system, to see whether this particular portfolio on its own achieves those so that if it is combined with your broader balance sheet, it doesn't at least make anything worse or create the likelihood of breaching any of those covenants. So this is the output at a scenario level. You can also see all of that summarized at a portfolio level for any individual portfolio in a given year that you're looking at as well. Next, there are sections where you can input the assumptions around the physical resource portfolio itself, as well as the financial inputs and assumptions that you want to make. And what I'm going to do is walk you through how to input each of these assumptions in order. Now, you can open all of these closed up groups by pressing on the 3 button here to open them all up. But I'm going to start to go through them one at a time to kind of walk you through what assumptions you can alter as you're inputting any individual portfolio and do the same on the financial inputs. So first of all, how do you start off? Well, first of all, there are some global portfolio options that help you define any particular portfolio that you look at. So let's suppose that you want to start with some portfolio of solar, wind, and storage that you want to see built in a particular year. Here we've picked 2026. And next, you're going to select a couple of, there are some toggles that you can push that'll help you understand or help you figure out what you want the model to figure out for you or not. For example, one of the key decisions that you may need to make is to figure out whether you want to use the production tax credit or the investment tax credit for assets that are eligible for both, particularly wind and solar. So there is a choice here that allows you to let the model select the optimum fraction to meet your financial constraints or not. And so here we've defaulted to allowing the model to do that, which is one of the things that this model in particular helps you understand for each portfolio and for each portfolio within a scenario. Secondly, you may choose within each portfolio to enforce a target equity ratio as a hard constraint at the portfolio level. Or you may choose not to do that and let the model only enforce that constraint on equity ratios at a scenario level over multiple portfolios. So choosing yes here would really enforce that constraint at a portfolio level, while choosing no would only see that constraint enforced at a scenario level. Now, similarly, there are some other global choices that you can make. And one of them that's really important here has to do with whether or not the utility is how it deals with what is effectively any margins or excess collections in rates that it might need to collect in order to maintain some of those financial ratios that we've discussed. Again, we know that there may be limitations and constraints on cooperatives that require you to collect enough to meet equity or interest or debt service coverage ratio constraints. However, if they are in excess, you have the option of assuming that those excesses are returned to your members as distributions. And you can pick a percentage for how much of that is distributed back to members in doing this analysis. Next, we also allow you to select costs either manually or to use NREL's annual technology baseline instead to determine your forward-looking costs for clean energy. And here you can set an assumption about whether you want to be moderate, conservative, or aggressive in the future costs, NREL costs that you can use to automatically set your future costs for any assets in your portfolio that are a few years out. The next thing that you can do is you can also set the assumed terms and conditions for either a PPA quote that you may already have for this portfolio, or if you want to rely on our calculations for the term for a hypothetical PPA that might be for the set of assets that you're looking at. And similarly, you can set the clean asset life for the purposes of assessing your potential ownership of the asset. So these are the overall portfolio inputs that you'd need to select. So let me move on from those portfolio level options to talk about a couple of other features. One other really important feature, particularly in the New Era program, is that the New Era program also provides utilities with the option of using a portion of the New Era debt to refinance unrecovered or costs or old debt associated with existing assets. And so one of the options here is you can enter in a fair bit of the details on that old plant or old debt that you might be refinancing. You can enter in, for example, the unrecovered plant balance in the current year associated with that asset or associated with the unrecovered or the debt that might be outstanding or the unrecovered balance for rate making purposes can be entered in to row 85. You can set what the remaining current life for rate making purposes is of the asset or the remaining life of any debt that is encumbering the asset maybe. You can set assumptions around what the old plant equity assumptions for the rate-making impact of the old plant to compare to any refinancing benefits by setting the old plant equity and ratio and debt rate that should be used. And you can also select which facility might be used, whether it is a USDA New Era facility or other debt that might be used to enable the refinancing. Now, the model automatically will take a look, and if you don't have any New Era award sufficient to use, for example, USDA financing, it'll tell you that you got to use some other debt. So it has some ability to at least make sure that you're not promising more than you can than you have enough support from the federal government to achieve. In addition, one thing that I will note is that the model also calculates and helps you understand the extent to which any particular choice of New Era financing might impact your total New Era award. It calculates what's known as the credit subsidy cost. So if you make a choice to use New Era debt and use very aggressive, for instance, 0% debt from New Era, it'll help you understand how that reduces, how much of an impact that will have on your total award size or how much of your award is used up by that. Next, you have the flexibility to make a couple of choices about how you use the refinancing facility being provided by, for example, USDA or other debt. Whether you assume that that's going to be refinancing that's immediately recycled into the capital that you use to build the new asset portfolio that you've got, or whether you use it specifically to refinance a portion of the debt. If, for example, your old plant equity ratio is 0, really all you've got is some encumbrance of debt and there's no equity tied to it, then it's just debt. Otherwise, it might be refinancing that old debt and equity. So you've got a choice to make here. We generally assume that you're going to actually use the proceeds here rather than to actually pay off old debt. We're assuming as a default that you're going to recycle that capital into your new assets. And then if, however, you do use it to pay off actual old debt, we also have the option for you to select how much of a prepayment penalty there might have been for paying off early that debt that was encumbering your existing asset. So those are the basic choices you have to use New Era financing to address old plant debt and or impacts on ratepayer costs. So next, I want to move to talk a little bit about the metrics that you can enter in about the new portfolio that you're deploying in the year that you've selected. Now, as I said, you can deploy solar, wind, or storage in any combination of them, and you're able to deploy whatever mix you'd like. And if you'd like, the metrics you can enter in here, if in any given portfolio, can be for a single asset. You might want to create portfolios that are lots of single assets, even in the same year. But here you have the flexibility to really combine them if you want to see how they all work together. We'd recommend you really do that. So combine all the assets that you're deploying in a given year, ideally into a single portfolio, so you can see how the different incentives for different projects, particularly for ITC versus PTC, all work together, because there are certain important ways in which they can. So generally speaking, what we'd recommend is that in the solar metrics section, you can enter in the aggregate solar asset that you're deploying, solar assets, the aggregate data for the solar assets that you're deploying in a given year. Now, one option is that you can use NREL data to populate the cost. If you are looking at solar assets that you may be deploying years out and you don't know what to expect in terms of that cost, this is an easy option to take. The model will just use NREL's ATB, depending on whether you've chosen earlier on in the portfolio options, whether it's a moderate, conservative, or aggressive cost trajectory. It'll filter in and appropriately give you the costs in that build year. Note that the model has incorporated into it inflation assumptions. So it's taking forward-looking inflation expectations, and it is actually inflating out in nominal dollars what that expected cost is in future years. So it's appropriate for financing and financial analysis. On the other hand, if you choose not to, you can also select no to use NREL data. And if you've got information, you can input directly the cost, the CapEx expected fixed or variable O&M cost, and input your expected capacity factor. You can also choose an NREL solar class or wind class here so that you don't have to, you can also allow the model to pick an appropriate capacity factor given depending on the specific class of resource that you think you may have. So with that, you also have some other options here in terms of the resource, the asset itself. You can also choose to input a user-defined escalation of O&M costs if you'd rather not use just expected inflation, which is what is assumed by the model. And you can include that escalation factor directly in the this section of the model. Further, you may be given a discount if you choose a build transfer agreement to own an asset. So you can put in if there was a discount given to you on the CapEx relative to what may be the case otherwise if a third party were to build and finance it. On the flip side, there may be it may be the case that you may assume that a developer who wants to own this may have a lot of other clean energy facilities, and they may be able to service an asset with contracts they've got in place or the capability they have at a lower cost than you do. And so you can either assume that there may be some difference in how a PPA in the O&M cost for a PPA relative to ownership. For example, if you want to own an asset, you might want a full wrap so that you don't have to worry about the O&M. That might cost a little bit more. And so this is a place where you can incorporate that difference between the potential O&M costs for you owning the asset relative to a third party doing it. Next, of course, very importantly, you want to put in the total aggregate solar capacity that you have in mind, and input your assumption for how that solar capacity degrades over time. Solar panels have a fairly well-known or well-understood annual degradation in capacity if they are not, if panels are not replaced, and that is usually included in every model, and it can be included here. The next thing I want to flag is that it is often very important, and this is often a really important question as you're considering your potential build options. There are two very important adders for any solar, wind, or battery project that depend on whether the project achieves or meets the IRS requirements on domestic content. So you may have a portfolio of projects where you may expect that some of the solar projects can do in fact meet the threshold or are expected to meet the threshold of domestic content. So you feel comfortable that you might get a 10% adder on your incentive, either an extra 10% for the ITC or a 10% increase in the PTC, depending on which is chosen. And if you do, you can select the percentage of that 800 megawatts, in this case, of capacity that you believe is likely to achieve the domestic content. This is one of the key variables that you might want to vary between scenarios as you compare different potential scenarios. Similarly, you may want to also, you may have a view as to which of the assets that you're deploying are in a community that the IRS map suggests are likely to meet the definition of an energy community for the energy community bonus adder. And again, you can enter in this percentage as well for your for your solar portfolio. And then finally, and I think this is the critical point, depending on whether you choose to have the model figure out this or you want to select it for yourself, you could select the fraction of these assets that you would like to sell, you would select the PTC on rather than the ITC. We generally believe that for most solar and wind projects, the economics are more attractive to select the production tax credit, the PTC, rather than the investment tax credit. But this allows you, the model can, if you chose in portfolio options, to selected yes in row 74, the model is going to try to do this optimization on the fraction of solar taking the PTC on its own to give you a sense of how much, what fraction you should use. But if you selected no, you're going to want to select your desired or expected fraction of these assets that will take the PTC rather than the ITC. Now, why would you, just as an aside, why would you ever really want to take the ITC relative to the PTC? Well, the PTC does involve more production risk that you bear if you own the asset, while the ITC does not have that risk, but might have a lower overall benefit. On the other hand, the bonus adders for the ITC may be larger. So this is not necessarily as easy to figure out. One of the advantages of using the model to optimize it is that the model helps you, essentially does that optimization looking for, does a search to really figure out what that optimum fraction really looks like given the choices that you make on, or the domestic content and energy community adders that you've got in place and the particular characteristics of your asset. So with that, I'm not going to go through the wind metrics because the wind metrics are almost exactly the same. You have the same choices that you can make on your wind portfolio as you do the solar portfolio. I will note that for the battery, things are a little bit different. The main differences in the battery is that you don't have a choice to make about whether a battery can take the ITC or the PTC. It is only eligible for the investment tax credits. I'll note that that's a little different with the utility scale battery storage. And the second thing I'll note is that in the while you do choose a battery capacity, the NREL classes do allow you to choose different potential number durations for that energy storage for the costs that that are automatically generated. So if you use NREL battery data, you will need to also select the number of hours or the duration of the battery to get the appropriate that are appropriate for your portfolio. Now, you can only make one choice for a given portfolio, so there isn't, at least at present, a way to create a portfolio, to create multiple different durations for any given portfolio's battery storage. And so this will need to be a weighted average, for example. Next, in addition to incorporating the metrics and the portfolio choices on the battery, the model also includes the ability to incorporate the details about the potential transmission build. Here, you're able to enter in a CapEx and an annual OpEx, and you are able to select whether or not the transmission costs associated with that build are escalated or not. Now, this assumes these CapEx and OpEx amounts and escalation are assuming that the co-op owns the transmission and that there is an asset life associated with it. Instead, or in addition, you can also pick to incorporate a transmission service charge associated with your asset if you're not expecting that you'll be able to own the transmission to, for example, interconnect the portfolio of assets that you've got. And you can incorporate into here an averaged transmission service charge for the portfolio of solar, wind, and battery that you've deployed with an annual inflation adjustment as well. So there's some flexibility in whether you want to incorporate the transmission into as an owned asset or as a service charge. Now, for any given portfolio, we do not allow for any differences. So the transmission charges here are either or both CapEx that you're going to be building and a service charge. They apply to the entire portfolio. That being said, the next section is you can also enter in, if you have information for this particular portfolio that you're entering in, a quote from a third party. You can enter in that quote directly. You can enter in the PPA price, any annual inflation adjustment. You can make some choices about whether the batteries are included in the PPA price or not, similarly on the transmission, and whether you want to include, use the same resource assumptions that are made in the solar, wind, and battery sections, or whether you'd like the quote to have its own resource assumptions, including PPA annual volume and degradation that is different from those assumed for the assets that you would purchase. Finally, in some cases, you may be able to generate additional revenues from markets for these resources. If they're, for instance, able to dispatch into the market, for instance, if your battery is able to provide you arbitrage revenues that are not necessarily included or incorporated in your revenue requirements that are coming from market transactions, you can include those additional portfolio revenues or costs as positives or negatives in this section here. Just make sure that you clear them and each time you build a new portfolio. So that's the bulk of the resource portfolio inputs and assumptions. And now I'm going to move on to the final section, which is the financial inputs and assumptions. Here, there are sections where you can enter in your utilities financial metrics first. And let me just talk a little bit about that. The first, there are really only two sets of financial metrics that we use in the model that are related to your utility itself. The first is we need you to enter in a discount rate. That discount rate can be taken to be from a couple of different choices. One, you can use a rate of return, your ROE or other ROR as the choice, or you can instead make a choice to put in a manual discount rate. And here, just for reference, we've included the average co-op ROE here, and then you'll see here which one of all of these are chosen, just to make sure that you've got the discount rate that you'd like to use for the calculation incorporated. Next, we'll note that the model actually does include, for some subset of utilities that we were able to find information from financial reports, we actually do we can auto-populate some of these critical metrics. And so you can choose a utility. If your utility appears here, if your cooperative appears here, we can auto-populate some of these ROE and ROR and cost of debt metrics. However, the default is that you would input this manually and that you are required to input your expected ROE, your cost of debt, your overall ROR, and your sort of historic equity ratio as financial inputs. And again, you can select, if your utility happens to be on our list, you can select that from your most recent annual report. So with those assumptions, I want to move over. So those are generic utility assumptions that we primarily use in order to look at the refinancing of an old plant. But for your clean portfolio, we indeed do use some of your historical rate of returns. That is used as well. ROE is used in our assessment of your clean portfolio. But we allow you to separately incorporate a target equity ratio that you'd like to see for this portfolio and then for each subsequent portfolio and then in aggregate. The target equity ratio that you would like to see met for the financing in isolation that you're going to be getting for these new clean energy assets. Similarly, what any modified debt service coverage maybe or margin for interest would need that you'd like to see met by for the financing that's provided and the revenue requirements that are associated with any given portfolio of assets. And so these key metrics are entered in here, and you can see that you can compare them to the actual outputs of the model to verify that those metrics indeed have been met in any given portfolio in the outputs, and as well up above for any scenario, including multiple portfolios. Next, you have the option to set some macroeconomic parameters. Here, we use, again, I've mentioned that we project forward-looking inflation based on a break-even inflation rate and a 5-year forward expected inflation rate. We set these sometime late last year based on the St. Louis Federal Reserve's data from November of last year. And these data points can be manually updated if you so desire. But generally speaking, we recommend you leave those macro metrics unchanged. You can similarly set a different value for long-run inflation as well, if you so desire. The next section summarizes, based on the portfolio inputs and the details that you've entered in, the financing that is required to achieve ownership of this asset and the financing that's required in the PPA case. For example, why would there be financing in the PPA case? Well, if you have some transmission that you're actually owning, then that is assumed to be financing that is required even in the PPA case, or if the battery wasn't included, for example. And so there is some financing that is required either in the ownership case or the PPA case, and that's just provided as an output here. There's nothing to input in that section. So that gets us to the next important section where we discuss the specific inputs that are tied in particular to the New Era award and other key grants that you may be considering here. So the first thing we incorporate here is for each portfolio in a given scenario, you can set the percentage of the maximum New Era award, which is $970 million, that is usable for this particular financing portfolio. Now, let's suppose your award is less than that. Well, you start with that lower percentage and then set here a percentage of that, the percentage of the $970 million that you would like to deploy to this one. And next, you can check in your full scenario that the sum is equivalent to the percentage of the $970 million that you've actually been awarded. Next, you can set the fraction of costs. If you are looking to get a GRIP award, you can set the fraction of costs post-ITC that is to be covered by the GRIP award. Next, finally, you've got the ability to enter in the amount, which is treated as a grant by the model, of a PACE forgivable loan. So if you are given a PACE award, which is up to $100 million, a portion of that, between 20 and 60%, can be a forgivable loan. And for the purposes of that model, you would enter in here the portion of your total award that is a forgivable loan. And then beyond that, you also have the ability to enter in any additional grants that you may be getting from other federal programs. The model will automatically calculate the ITC that may be available to you, that since a cooperative is eligible for elective pay, that you may have available as a result of the use of elective pay. And so the model then calculates the total amount of grants, the ITC, that are available to the utility if you choose ownership, as well as any grant that may be available even in the PPA case. The next section focuses on the options that you have for debt financing. Now, our model currently focuses primarily on the long-term debt that you use to pay off this asset. It does not at present include the ability to vary inputs on any construction debt or financing that's used. So the assumptions here are around what fraction of USDA New Era, PACE, or other debt is used to finance, to provide long-term financing for this portfolio of assets. This section of the model incorporates, allows you to input for each option in New Era, 0%, 2%, or treasuries level debt, the fraction of new asset financing that you're looking to use 0% debt, 2% debt, or treasuries. So that's the first input that you put in. As it turns out, though, your New Era award will limit these fractions. And so the model actually incorporates those limitations. So whatever you might choose, in this case, for example, I've chosen to use, to try to use 100% of 2% debt to finance my portfolio. Unfortunately, the amount of New Era grant award that I was given, I said here, was 15% of the maximum, doesn't actually allow me to finance the portfolio that I've put in here, which had 800 megawatts of solar, 200 megawatts of wind, and 700 megawatts of storage. That's a lot. It required $2 billion of financing, and I don't have nearly enough New Era award that I've allocated to this to be able to finance all of that with 2% debt. So instead, it limits me to just 36% of that. It figures out what that amount is and how much I can do. That would mean, and if I look up here in the grant section, that would mean, unfortunately, that I really have no grant available because I've used all of that award to allow me to get this subsidized 2% debt. Given that, the model then figures out, oh, well, you've got to get the rest of your debt from somewhere. And so the model tells me that I've got to get other debt for 64% of it, and I can put in the conditions of that other debt down here. Now, for each type of debt, I can put in the tenor of the debt, and I can put in the loan-specific transaction costs as a percentage of my overall costs for that particular loan, upfront fee in this case. Now, the assumption here that we make here is that you can also potentially incorporate PACE debt. So if you are given an award for PACE for some portion of this portfolio, you can also include here the portion. And again, there is a limitation here that takes into account the maximum limitation on PACE award, but you can put in the characteristics of the portion of PACE debt here that is not forgivable, which is the portion that should be included here. Note that PACE is tax exempt, so that the cost of that debt may have a cost that is below treasuries. And so the way that you specify that is to put in a spread, a difference between treasuries of the appropriate tenor, which you can see up above here, is the treasuries rate that has been calculated for the year that you're and the tenor that you're looking at. And you can put in a spread, a positive or negative spread above that. Now, similarly, for any other debt that you can get, you can model this as debt from CoBank or CFC, or debt that you issue in some other way, or debt that you get from a different USDA window, by just putting in what that spread needs to be. What is the difference in debt cost, the percentage above US Treasuries of the appropriate tenor that you're going to be paying is what you want to put into this one. Now, the other option that you have is you can actually, there's a couple of different styles of repayment, and you have the option to either assume that your debt principal payments are level in each year, or that they're more like a mortgage with a level overall payment each year. And you can do that separately for each type of debt here. So that's how you enter in your debt assumptions. Now, note that one of the things that you might want to look at and change between portfolios and scenarios are these financing assumptions. And you can always change these financial assumptions. And then at the end of the day, once you've included all these financial assumptions, you can hit calculate portfolio results and see what it does to the ownership cost. Try to find the combination that works best for you. We don't automatically do that optimization, but you can very often and very frequently. We believe that the optimal solution is often maximizing the 2% debt that you use if you have access to USDA funding. And so often what we suggest is that you use 100% of what you can of the 2% debt, and then hit calculate to see what the optimal percentage ends up being and how much additional debt you might want to use from other sources. Now, occasionally, it might be feasible to use a little bit of 0% debt as well. And you can add that in to see how it alters the mix, to see if it helps or not. So with that, that's how you can, this is one of the key areas that you may want to play with to help you understand how to use different mixes of USDA and other financing options to really achieve your optimal ratio of or your optimal savings for your customers. Next, I want to just show you here what else you can see in the model. And one thing that you can see is, given the assumptions that you put in here, one of the final things that you can see is the final capital structure that you realize given the assumptions that you placed in. And this will show you, well, how much debt equity grants are used to achieve long-term financing of your asset. And it'll also tell you if you need to collect additional equity from your members as part of the costs that are built into the model. And if that equity raise will usually mean that there is some early year in which there is a slightly higher cost. So it's something to pay attention to as you're looking at the results of any given model. Now, we will note that there are some other assumptions here on tax incentives and other assumptions that you can also play around with, but these are assumptions that are generic for all tax incentives and and about the way that we calculate certain the PPAs. And we suggest that you not generally leave these closed and do not alter them. moving forward. So with that, if you enter all of these pieces into the model, you can then start to the next step to really use the model is for any particular portfolio that you've entered in. You can hit this button here next to the resource portfolio outputs and summary that says calculate portfolio results to figure out for that particular asset, for this particular portfolio that you put in and the assumptions that you've included here, what the levelized costs and ownership NPV are. This runs a macro that calculates this. And so once that's done, you can look back down and make some changes, for example. Let's suppose that you wanted to look at a different option. So we've looked at just 15% of the New Era grant applied here. And that only allows 36% of the debt to be 2% debt. What if we were to try to use some 0% debt instead? How would that affect the cost? Well, we can hit calculate portfolio results again. We see that the cost went up from about $56 and something to $57. So it didn't really help. So this is a quick way that you can use the model to kind of explore what your options are. So let me turn that back down to 0 and see what I did. Is it a little less? Indeed, it is. It is a little bit less than it was before. So that using the slightly more subsidized debt actually didn't help you. And the reason for that is because the cost of the portion of the USDA grant that you have available to you gets impacted by the amount of debt that you use. You can't use as much 0% debt as you can 2% debt. And in this case, it means that using 2% debt is actually more attractive than using 0% debt because of that fact. On the other hand, using more treasuries doesn't help because it turns out that the impact of the treasury's debt in New Era is the same as the 2% debt on the amount of the award that it takes for a given loan volume, which means that it really doesn't necessarily help to go to treasury's debt. So with that, you can see and you have a portfolio and you've already figured out that 2% debt is a pretty good option for this portfolio. Now, what would you like to do with it? Well, this isn't all you want to do. Your portfolio, you might be building more than just a portfolio of clean energy in 2026. You're also hoping to build out some more in 2028 that uses some of these same federal incentives. So to be able to look at both what happens with this portfolio in this year, but what happens in aggregate if you use a portion of your New Era grant for this portfolio, but also use a portion in a future year, you might want to save this record and create your new portfolio in 2028, and then see what happens when you pull it all together. So the first thing you do is you come up to the top here, and well, I've got the ability to actually record information about different portfolios. Where are they saved? Well, actually, they're saved just over to the right here in this same tab in the scenario and portfolio record here. You don't want to edit any of this except, especially you don't want to edit the record counter. But this is where each portfolio that you might choose to record is saved. So let's first of all save this particular record by hitting the Save Record button. So this records that record in the first record counter. So all of the inputs and most of the portfolio outputs I put in are saved in this first column. Now what do I want to do? Well, I want to enter in my second portfolio. So let me do that. So I'm going to call this, I'm going to create a new record counter. I can see up here that the next available record is number 2. So I'm going to use that to create a new record. I'm going to call that 2. And I'm going to keep it as part of the same scenario. I want to look at this as part of the same overall scenario that I'd like to cost out. But this is the second portfolio in that scenario. So I'm going to hit a portfolio number to 2 for this. Now I want to make some edits to this to reflect this new portfolio. So I'm going to enter in the details for this new portfolio. It's going to be built not in 2026, but in 2028. I still want to make sure that it's using the PTC, maximizing the PTC for me. And I really want to make sure that the equity ratio is targeted in the same way. It's still going to be a 30-year asset. I still don't, in this case, I'm going to add something. I know that I've got a plant that's retiring in that year that I want to add to this story. And that plant has about 100 million right now in unrecovered plant balance. It's got 20 years remaining in life right now, but when it retires right now, and when it retires, it's going to, it's been financed on my balance sheet. And I want to see if I can't use USDA refinancing to help me deal with that unrecovered plant balance. So I'm not having my customers pay a lot more than they need to, both for the old asset and the new asset. And I'm going to imagine that actually I'm going to use this refinancing of that old plant capital to recycle into my new assets. So I'm not going to pay off my old debt. I'm keeping the old debt that I had, but I'm going to assume that this refinancing, I've got the flexibility from USDA to use this refinancing to kind of get this capital for that unrecovered balance, to remove it from my rates, and just assume that this financing is used to finance my new assets. So I'm going to keep that as recycled into new assets. Next, I'm going to assume that for this case, I'm going to use NREL data again, but I'm going to assume that this portfolio of assets has just a different amount of solar. So I'm going to assume that this is about 600 megawatts of solar. But I'm going to assume that actually in this future year, I've got a greater chance that this is going to be a domestic content. And I know that half of them are still in energy communities. So that's the change I'll make. For the wind, I'm going to assume that this wind is, again, I think that by this time, half of it might meet the domestic content requirement, and it might be an energy community. So I'm pretty optimistic about that. And similarly for my batteries, maybe I also think that there's going to be more domestic content. I'm going to have a greater chance in 2028 that I'm going to be able to get domestic content. Oh yeah, I forgot. I'm going to also increase the amount of wind. I think that I'm going to be able to build a little bit more wind by 2028 because the supply chain constraints aren't going to be as bad. And I might need a bigger battery because by that time, I think I'm worried that the utilization that I'm going to need some additional storage to make sure that I'm able to use the wind and solar and don't have to curtail it. So I've got a bigger battery that I think I need than I thought I would need previously. And I've got about 1,000 megawatts, I'm assumed, to cover 400 and 600. So I've got basically a 1-to-1 ratio of batteries to wind and solar here. And I'm going to assume that it is going to need to be a 4-hour battery again. I'm assuming that I've got about the same amount of transmission that I need to build, so I'm not changing that. And the quote that I have, well, I don't really have a good quote, so I'm not going to change this any, but I'm really looking at the calculated price here. So I don't really have a good quote for this, but I'm going to assume that it might have been because it's a bigger battery installation, it might be a bit more expensive. Next, on the financial assumptions, I'm not going to change any of the financial assumptions that I've made for my utility ROE, and I'm going to keep the same targets. The one thing I am going to change is that I'm going to assume that I actually have a little bit less of New Era award left at that point to use for this new set of assets. I used 15% for my previous one, and now I'm going to assume that there's only 10% left because I'm only going to have about 25% of my New Era award to use. So I don't have as much of my New Era award. So I'm going to assume that I'm going to be able to use a little bit of USDA 2% debt, but a lot of the debt is going to be coming from other debt. And I'm going to be using, I'm assuming I'm going to be able to ask the USDA to give me that debt too as a treasury rate loan. So with these assumptions, I'm going to next hit calculate to see what this new portfolio cost looks like. So I'm going to calculate the portfolio results. And it looks like it calculated that the total cost of electricity in that year's for ownership is pretty good, $57 a megawatt hour, better than if I purchased it. That's interesting to know. Here I've got a summary of what I assumed in terms of the New Era award, 10%. And it's about this portfolio with 600 megawatts of solar, 400 megawatts of wind, and 1,000 megawatts, a gigawatt of storage. But I've got some more incentives here that I'm able to use. So what do I want to do next? Well, I've got this second portfolio, and now I want to be able to save this record in and I'm going to hit Save Record to save this. And so I've saved it into my second slot. This is great. This is my portfolio. I see I've got a range of build years from 2026 to 2028, but I actually need to take another step. This portfolio, I see that there's some scenario results here, but it turns out that these scenario results are not, because I just saved this new record and I've got two new portfolios here. I need to hit the calculate scenario results before I can see what the overall story is for both assets, so that I can compare ownership to the PPA cost for the overall scenario that I've put in here. And so what I need to do next is, now that I've got both records saved, I can go over here and the two records are here. They seem to have the appropriate summary. I've got a mix of solar and wind, and I've got a bit more storage in 2028, a little bit less New Era. So that's all looking like what I thought. Now let me hit calculate scenario results, and what the model will do is calculate what the overall costs are for the whole scenario and help me understand how I'm doing in terms of achieving meeting the constraints for my my financial constraints for over all the years for the full scenario. So let me hit that button. It'll take some time for it to calculate, so please be patient while it calculates. So as I've hit it, the screen will go blank at some point, but don't worry, the model is still calculating. And you can see below that it's calculating on all of its threads the different portfolio options. You can see that the button is still depressed, so it's continuing to calculate here. It's not yet done. But eventually the ownership, these ownership amounts will change, and you see that right now it has completed. Now what do we see in the results? We see that the model is indeed able to meet these at a scenario level, achieve the appropriate equity ratio. It's able to achieve the targeted debt service 1.05 debt service coverage and the margin at an overall scenario level. Sorry. It uses 25% of the maximum award, so 25% of the $970 million. Hopefully that's the same amount as potentially the portion of the award you wanted to allocate to this. And you can see up here the overall costs. Now, in this record, the results are saved in the scenario and portfolio record in the scenario output scenario, so that you can see the net impact of the selections that you've made at a scenario level. So now, what else can you do with this model? We've defined a single scenario with two portfolios. However, you can also create additional scenarios to compare against this scenario. So for example, let's suppose we wanted to take this same portfolio of resources and we wanted to actually construct a second scenario, but with different assumptions on which assets were able to achieve domestic content and which were not. So let's see how we would do that. So to do that, the first thing I would do is to take this existing record. I've got record counter 2, and I want to replace it first with record counter 1. I want to load the first record again and change the assumptions for that first record and save it into the next available record, which is record 3. So first, I'll hit 1 in record counter and load the existing record. That loads the original asset portfolio, the one in 2026 into memory, into the inputs. Next, I want to make the changes in the assumed bonus adders. Let's suppose I want to look at a situation where I couldn't get any of the domestic content in any of the wind, solar, or storage. So I'm going to take that to 0. And in fact, I want to make it a little worse. I wasn't able to cite it in an energy community. At least I wasn't able to cite the wind in an energy community or the solar in an energy community. So this is a much less attractive situation. So first of all, I'm going to take this new assumption and calculate what the portfolio results are. Next, after calculating that, I want to save this into a new record. But I want to save this into a new record that's going to be a new scenario. First, I check what the next available record is. That's a record 3. So I put in record 3 here. Next, I want this to be a new scenario, and this is portfolio 1 in that new scenario. So I'm going to enter 2 here. Now, this scenario doesn't yet exist. So the first thing I want to do is to save this record. This record and scenario doesn't exist. So I want to save this record first. So I'm going to hit Save Record. And so right now, I have saved a new record. If I look over here, there's a new record, record 3, with portfolio number 1 and scenario number 2 that saves the results of this new portfolio. Now, it doesn't yet have sensible build years or scenario level results because I haven't calculated them yet. The next thing I want to do is to load another existing record, record 2, in to the current portfolio. Well, I've loaded that in, and I want to modify it as well and save it as record 4 in a bit. So let me start by modifying this. This won't modify the one that's recorded already in scenario 1, but I need to make the modifications to make sure that I've done something similar here. Let's suppose I get no domestic content, no energy communities adders for the solar and wind. All right, I've made those changes. Now, the next thing I want to do is to save this new record. Well, I want to put this in the next available record. I want to put it in record 4. I want this to be scenario number 2, and I want it to be portfolio 2 of that scenario. So now let me save that. All right, great. Let me check over here. Indeed, I've got this new scenario. It looks a lot like, when I look at the portfolio, it looks a lot like portfolio 1, but it doesn't have the bonus adders. But it looks like portfolio 2 of scenario 1, but it doesn't have the bonus adders. So that's what I wanted. Great. Next, I've got scenario 2 open, and the thing that I want to do is to calculate scenario results for scenario 2. I haven't done that yet, so it's not recorded yet. So let me, now that I've got the second portfolio in, or second portfolio of scenario 2 in, I can calculate the scenario results. And again, we have to wait while it calculates, but it's now calculating the costs for that second scenario. And once I have those costs, I can compare it to the previous case to see how much of a difference it made for me not to be able to claim the bonus adders for the solar and wind in my portfolios in this second scenario. All right, now I can compare the scenarios that I've recorded, scenario 2 with scenario 1. And what it shows me is that indeed I see just about a $2.50 a megawatt hour difference going between one and the other with and without the bonus adders. And so this helps me understand what my risk is if I was not able to achieve the domestic content and energy community adders. And it helps me better understand the range of different costs that I've got. Finally, I wanted to flag here the ability to use our results tab to be able to look at all of this in more detail. So if the results tab allows you to see and pull in the results for different scenarios or portfolios. It shows the key results here, allows you to, in fact, select different metrics that you want to show for the resources and finances, and generate the final cost outputs, and then selectively copy and paste as values into these scenario cases, and then further into these graphs to allow you to see how those ranges of output values differ as you look at multiple scenarios and portfolios. We hope that the model will help you realize the extraordinary ambition that cooperatives across the country have shown in their letters of interest to the New Era program and in their applications to PACE, GRIP, and other programs. We hope that this will help co-ops take the ingenuity and initiative that we've seen and see it realized in new assets in rural communities that lead to lower costs across the country and economic development and jobs. And we're here to find ways to help you achieve those goals. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. We appreciate your interest in the calculator and look forward to hearing from you.
you.